Now the next speaker is Rob DiStasio, and I see that he's already here. Welcome. Robert is an assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Cornell University. He received his PhD from University of California, Berkeley, and did a postdoc at Princeton University, I believe in this very building. Is that correct?
Yes. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes. So he's well known for his work on the development and application of electronic structure simulation methods. He's a developer of Quantum Espresso, and we are going to have a tutorial on that later. He has made many relevant contributions. I would like to highlight the description of many-body van der Waals interactions within density functional theory and applications thereof, such as the prediction of polymorphism in drug-like molecules. We're very happy to have you, and I'm happy to have you today. The floor is yours, Robert.
Thanks, Pablo, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Thank you, Roberto. So today I want to tell you a story. It's a little bit of an application where we combine the developments that you guys have been working on in the deep potential or the DPMD model with an order-end framework for condensed phase hybrid DFT. Right. So the motivation here is fuel cells. Right. So fuel cells have really been recognized for a long time by NASA, especially as having a lot of advantages over conventional batteries because of a couple of things, right? Their attractive energy to weight ratio, and they provided power for a number of different operations. I have them listed above in some cool pictures that I was able to find online. And for example, the one on the right shows a particular type of fuel cell, which is an alkaline fuel cell. This is not the traditional type of fuel cell, and I'm going to talk about that more in a moment. And for example, that covered all the electrical and drinking water needs for the Space Shuttle orbiter. Now, these alkaline fuel cells are really a potentially environmentally friendly energy source. But they're a bit different than your traditional acidic fuel cells, right? So for one, they use a base, something like KOH, as the electrolyte, as opposed to an acid. So that's why it's a basic or alkaline fuel cell. And of course, in the middle, between the cathode and anode, you have this polymer, which has to allow transport of water and the conducting ion. So these in a alkaline fuel cell, you're going to have an anion exchange membrane, which has to allow water to flow and hydroxide to flow, versus your traditional proton exchange membranes like Nafion, which allow hydronium and water to flow. Now we have there's a couple of pros that people talk about with these alkaline fuel cells. Number one is the enhanced kinetics at the ORR, right? The oxygen reduction reaction, and the potential to use non-precious materials like nickel and silver. The cons, however, are all related to hydroxide, right? Hydroxide is known to have a decreased conductivity with respect to hydronium, and also it's a very strong nucleophile, so it tends to chew up and break down this polymer membrane. So at Cornell, we have a DOE center, right, an EFRC called CABES. This is the Center for Alkaline-Based Energy Solutions, and it's a team of something like 20-odd scientists and groups trying to solve these problems. And the problem that I've been working on is attacking this membrane stability issues and the decreased hydroxide conductivity from a theory point of view. All right, so what are the sort of questions that we like to answer scientifically? Well, it's really a matter of confined diffusion, right? And so I'm going to talk about, how does water diffuse through confined environments? How does hydronium and hydroxide, of course, there's an emphasis on hydroxide with respect to the CABES funding. How does hydroxide diffuse through these confined environments? And of course, this is a really, really challenging problem that is, in some sense, a challenge for both statistical and quantum mechanics. And I'm going to tell you why, of course. Statistically speaking, we really need to be dealing with experimentally relevant length and time scales. So these are time scales that are just beyond the reach of ab initio molecular dynamics. And so we're going to need some methods and developments to deal with that fact. So the questions again are, how can we better understand and control transport in these confined environments? What are the diffusion rates of the ion and water through an exchange membrane? How is the diffusion affected by the channels in the membrane, the radius or diameter, whether they're hydrophobic or hydrophilic? What about the hydroxide concentration? Also, these anion exchange membranes have cationic groups distributed throughout them. How does that affect diffusion, et cetera, et cetera? So really hard problems, and of course, really interesting problems of fundamental and applied nature. Right, so let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail. So if we take a look at experimental results for the conductivities of hydronium and hydroxide in something like Nafion, again, this is the proton exchange membrane and an alkaline exchange membrane that was developed at Cornell, you see a nice trend, right? You see that it's that the hydronium is about 2.5 or 2 and change times faster than the hydroxide. If you look at the bulk, right, 1 molar hydronium, 1 molar hydroxide, you basically see the same thing. All right, so bulk, there's similar trends between membrane and bulk. However, when you go down to it and look at it with theory, again, I'm looking at now at the sort of second rung of density functional theory, a GGA like PBE, you get an inverse trend, right, where the hydroxide is actually diffusing faster than the hydronium. And this is a qualitatively and, of course, quantitatively wrong prediction. And the problem here, of course, is that both the vehicular, right, just the ion moving through space, and the structural diffusion, where it's jumping through the Grotius mechanism, must be accurately described, and that's not a trivial effort. So that brings us to the DFT hierarchy, right? So can we do better? Well, John Perdue laid out the so-called Jacob's ladder. It's a sort of semi-systematic approach for improving density functional theory. Right, starts out with LDA and GGA, right, where they're using the density and the gradient of the density, and goes from there, right? And the problem is that, of course, the GGA level is really the workhorse in condensed phase simulations. Definitely not in molecules, but definitely in the condensed phase. And that has 2 problems, right? It has self-interaction error, in which electrons interact with themselves, and this, of course, is deleterious and leads to excessive orbital localization and many other problems. And there's also a lack of the long-range von der Waals or dispersion interactions at that level of theory, right? Those are really a 2-point correlation function and really require a beyond a 1 particle theory. All right, so how are we going to attack this? Well, in this approach, I'm going to talk about jumping up to the 4th rung of density functional theory. This is the hybrid DFT level. So we're going to add in exact exchange, which is a contribution from Hartree-Fock. Which will limit the self-interaction error, not remove it completely, but will ameliorate it to a large extent. And of course, we'll add a little von der Waals correction, which is another area where my group works on to account for that other deficiency. Now, of course, in most systems, this gives you a more accurate representation, in particular when you have bond breaking and forming, in particular when you have molecular systems or molecules interacting with materials or reactivity. However, it comes at a significantly larger expense. Right, so the computational challenge here, let me just show it to you in reciprocal space, is the following, right? You have the exact exchange integral. It's like a Coulomb integral, only the indices are a little bit shuffled, so you can't do the sum over I and j internally to the integrals forming a total density. Instead, you have to do this sum over all orbital pairs, and inside those orbital pairs, you can again multiply the orbitals together to give you a product density. And if you look at this integral, if I integrate over r prime with one of the product densities and the Coulomb operator, that's just the potential, right? That's the potential a test charge would feel at a point r from this product density. And again, with that being said, you can rewrite the exact exchange integral in this more compact form. Now, I highlighted 2 points in red, right? In the canonical form, right, you have to sum over all occupied orbitals, and you have to do the integral over all space. And that's really it, right? So how does that done in reciprocal space? You form these product densities in real space, you Fourier transfer them into reciprocal space, and then actually forming, and this is just for gamma point only at the moment, to form the potential in reciprocal space is fairly straightforward, and then you just invert it back to the inverse Fourier transform back to real space, and then you go back up and do this integral. The problem with that is that it's cubic in scaling, right? You have to do an FFT or a couple of FFTs, I should say, for each orbital pair. Again, neglecting the logarithmic term, you have a cubic cost, and that leads you to a cost that's 10, 100, or even more times larger than GGA. Now, one strategy that was really advanced by Roberto about 10, 15 or 12 years ago, rather, was that you can take advantage of the inherent sparsity if you do things in real space. And that's really what we do, right? We took the work that Roberto and Chiffon and Annabella worked on back in the end of the 2000s, and really just optimized it for the last several years. Right, so the idea here is that you do a unitary transformation from the canonical orbitals to a series of local orbitals. In the original versions, I'll talk more about this later, we were using MLWFs. These are the maximally localized Bonnier functions, the reciprocal space analogs of the Foster-Boys orbitals of quantum chemistry. So you get this unitary transformation, you localize the orbitals, and then once you have localized orbitals, you can form a localized product density. Now here's a picture of that for liquid water, right? It's really just, you have all your delocalized canonical orbitals. Now every water has 4 orbitals, right? 4 local orbitals, 2 bonding pairs and 2 lone pairs. Now, there's a couple of interesting things here. So again, this density here, because the 2 orbitals are sparse, right? We only have to worry about density orbitals that overlap, or the product density would be 0. And that's going to be our first level of savings. And you see that here in the energy, right? It's, as opposed to just a sum over all I and j, we're only going to sum over I and j that overlap. The second thing is, for those overlapping pairs, we're going to compute the potential using the Poisson equation, which is a second order elliptical boundary value problem, which of course requires us to set the boundaries, which we do through a multipole expansion of the density of these product densities. Now, again, where you solve that Poisson equation really only needs to be on the area where the orbitals overlap, and that leads to our second level of savings. So not only do we have less than the quadratic number of pairs, we have a linear number of pairs, we have a system size independent domain upon which we solve the Poisson equation. And it's those 2 that allow us to have a linear scaling. It takes us from cubic to linear scaling. Now, the wave function forces, which you'll need for the potential, are also linear scaling. You see that here, right? The potential is never non-zero, and at worst, it's monopolar, but you're multiplying it by a sparse object. And in a recent publication, we also, with Shin-Yu Ko, who's a postdoc with me now and was a very talented PhD student in Roberto's group, we formed the stress tensor now, and that can also be done. So we have the cell forces that can also be done in linear time. Now, all of this, of course, is in quantum espresso. Everything is computed in real space with order and effort and controllable accuracy. We have a hybrid MPI and OpenMP algorithm, and you could do calculations on 100,000 processors or more. And again, with the right computational resources, the cost can be similar, cheaper, or on the order of a GGA DFT calculation. Now, again, this algorithm is really designed for ab initio molecular dynamics. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Again, it's very scalable on DOE leadership computers. Our typical accuracies on condensed phase systems are on the order of 0.02% or on that order with the default parameters. However, and our scaling is quite good. We're, of course, not perfectly strong scaling, but we can do things like water 256 in about 2 seconds or so on, last year's computers like the Blue Gene Q. All right, so if we take that algorithm now and run it on this problem, which is the diffusion of hydroxide and hydronium in the bulk, what do we get? Well, we get some very interesting and promising results. Again, I remind you that the experimentally speaking, you should get something like around 6 or so for the hydronium and about 3 for hydroxide, with a ratio of about 2 and change, right? So the hydronium should be faster than the hydroxide. And that, of course, drives that's what the experiment tells us. You do it with GGA, you get the inverse, right? You get a 0.6 ratio, where the hydroxide is 18 and the hydronium is 10 or 11. If you add some van der Waals, you get a little worse for the hydronium, but you get significantly better for the hydroxide. If you add exact exchange and van der Waals, you get better on both, and you get to a ratio that's actually not quite bad compared to the experimental observable. And this was a collaboration with Chiffon's group, Roberto's group, and Mike Klein over at Temple that we published in Nature Chemistry a couple of years back. Now, the interesting thing here is that, again, so here's the PBE column, the first one here, and this is the number of jumps that it takes as it transports, right? So in a hydronium, what you see is that there's some single jumps, mostly double and triple jumps, and a little bit of quadruple jumps. So this is how many water molecules that'll jump in a single event. And as you add van der Waals, that doesn't change qualitatively. And as you add van der Waals and exactly change, the hydronium picture doesn't change qualitatively, it changes quantitatively, but the hydroxide picture changes tremendously, right? They look almost the same at the PBE level or the GGA level. You add van der Waals, it changes a little bit, but when you add the hybrid and van der Waals, you see that something that was mostly jumping more concerted is now really governed by single or sequential jumps. And this is what's slowing down hydroxide, and it's the physical mechanism behind that, right? And this is because of a stabilizing hyper-coordinated solvation structure, that basically a resting state in which the hydroxide can't move unless it's not in that solvation structure. Now, that's the stability of that solvation structure really is a subtle interplay between hydrogen bonding and van der Waals interactions. And you see here between the 3 coordination structure, when it does diffuse, and the hypercoordination structure, you see that it's just completely different when you have a GGA versus a hybrid plus von der Waals. Here you see the hypercoordinated structure is more than 80% of the time, and that's why it's significantly slower down. So for the quantum mechanics of this problem, whether in bulk or in confinement, we really need a sophisticated level of theory, right? Something like dispersion inclusive hybrid DFT. All right, so how do we get there? Because I think we, again, we need to deal with experimentally length and time scales, right? So let me just talk about a couple of things before I show you how we do that, because there are improvements to the underlying exact exchange code that are going to allow us to do this. Of course, when we combine with a deep neural network model via the DPMD method. All right, so there are a couple of limitations to the alpha version of the exact exchange that I didn't care for, and I thought would be a problem if we started dealing with more and more heterogeneous systems, especially things that are in confined environments or molecules on surfaces. So we started this development a little while back. Okay, so again, the original version is really optimal for isotropic and homogeneous systems, right? So again, there's 2 things, right? We have a radial overlap criterion for determining pairs. Now, if the orbitals are all homogeneous and spherical, everything looks great, right? The red, we're sitting on the red orbital, we have this radial criterion, it sees the blue one there, okay, good, they're overlapping. The black one is outside of the blue of the red sphere of influence, and that's it, right? And these are the Vonnier centers. But what happens if the orbitals are anisotropic, like I have in this picture? Now a radial criterion breaks down. It would think that the red and black are overlapping pairs, but not the red and blue, when in fact the red and blue are. So what happens with the radial overlap criterion is you get false overlap assignments for anisotropic MLWFs. I don't like that, right? We need to move to more black box, robust, and high throughput methods, so that way we can train the machine learning models. Okay, so the second problem is we use a domain. We use fixed size spherical domains. All right, so now all we have to have is a domain that encompasses the overlap of the 2 orbitals. Then we are accurate, but that doesn't mean we're efficient. So what we use is a fixed domain, and we try to set the domain so that it's large enough to overlap the most overlapping pairs. When you do that, you're very accurate, but look, you're very inefficient when you have orbital pairs that are non-overlapping. So, right, so you have a trade-off. You're either inefficient for pairs that have a small overlap, or if you choose it to be smaller, you're going to be inaccurate for pairs with a large overlap. So again, the intrinsic anisotropy and heterogeneity in systems that we care about force the user to choose between accuracy and efficiency. And I don't care for that. So I tried to, with Shanu and several others in my group, we tried to develop a method that does not force that compromise, so that you can be as accurate as you want and be as performant as you can be. And here's the way we're doing that. We do it in 2 steps, right? The first thing we do is we find an axis-aligned bounding box with a system-independent coverage threshold. So we basically just choose this epsilon, and it's basically how much do you want to lose of an electron from a given orbital, right? Because this orbital, this integral here, if you do it over all space, should be equal to 1. And so we just have a little threshold. And now we find the box using a marginalized distribution bounding box search. It's a novel algorithm that came out of my group, basically a Lebesgue integral that one does to find the box that will encompass the orbital tightly. And in doing so, it intrinsically accounts for the anisotropy of each MLWF. So we know exactly where the MLWFs are, and we know their shape. Now, with that being said, we know exactly where they overlap. So now, instead of having spherical domains that are fixed in size, we use variable size domains that accommodate their non-uniform overlaps. And this is great because it actually reduces the domain size overall, because most of your pairs are non-local and long-range pairs. And because it's non-spherical, it's very efficient for vectorization. And so you can lower the cost without sacrificing accuracy, and you're amenable to GPU acceleration. So let me just show you a case study of this sort of beta version of the code that on 3 complex condensed phase systems. The first one is liquid water, right? Water 128. Everybody says, oh, water is a homogeneous system, but it's really not homogeneous from the point of view of doing a local exact exchange calculation. Again, there's different ways of looking at heterogeneity. There's heterogeneity in the spreads of the orbitals. There's heterogeneities in the number of pairs, right? That can be influenced by the density of the system or the structure of the system. There's heterogeneities in the domains, the Poisson domains. So there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in any system, even the most of homogeneous. So again, how do we see that, right? So our baseline quote unquote homogeneous system, we get a 5.7x speed up for the same accuracy, right? So if we do the same accuracy as we have in the original version, we can do it 6 times faster, which is great. So even for a homogeneous system, we're 6 times faster. So then we started thinking, okay, so we need some more challenging systems, and influenced by a conversation with Pablo and Stefano Baroni, they introduced us to this doped molten KCl system, right? So this is a spin unpolarized bipolaron system that is stabilized by lattice deformation, and it has a very interesting feature, right? Most of the Wannier functions have a similar spread, kind of similar to liquid water, maybe a little bit more spread out, but they have one orbital that's very, very delocalized and basically overlaps with everyone. So this is the exact, sort of test case that breaks down our original version, because you would have to choose the domain to be large enough to encompass this orbital, and you're just wasteful for all the other orbitals. And so in a system like this, we get almost beyond an order of magnitude speed up. We're getting about a factor of 11 in something like a bipolaron. And then for a sort of more heterogeneous, a multi-component, multi-phase system, right? This photocatalyst, the titanium dioxide liquid water, this came from Annabella's group, right? We see here basically another factor of 6. So again, this is what's going on behind the scenes in the exact exchange algorithm. So now it can do this with a system-independent threshold, so that there's no more user input. It can deal with heterogeneity, tremendous heterogeneity. Another extension, before I go back to the machine learning aspects of this talk and how we're dealing with the confined hydronium and hydroxide, is another extension that I'm really excited about, and that's to doing range-separated hybrids. Again, on that 4th rung of hybrid density, of DFT, what we're doing here is, and I'll just briefly mention it, is we're doing an alternative separation of the Coulomb kernel. So as opposed to doing the error function, right, ERF and ERFKA, which are just not very pleasant to work with, we're using a screen Coulomb interaction, or the Yukawa potential. And again, why we're doing that is here, because in the unscreened Coulomb case, the normal case, you have your potential, the multipole expansion for the potential. So the far field, you do a multipole expansion of the potential, and then in the near field, you solve Poisson's equation. Okay, for the Yukawa, you do a modified multipole expansion, right, where you use some Bessel function, so not a big deal at all, and you solve a modified Poisson equation where you simply subtract a constant off the diagonal, right, and it actually improves the conditioning a bit. So again, very, very minor changes to our algorithm. We get to take advantage of everything, and now we have range-separated hybrids. This week, we have it implemented in an in-house version of Quantum Espresso. And I should also mention that this will benefit from our recent work with Andrew Rapp at Penn and Lior Kornick at Weizmann Institute, where we developed range-separated hybrid pseudo-potentials, right, that are going to be available in Opium. All right, so those are some of the extensions I wanted to mention. Now I want to go back to this confined diffusion problem. Right, so again, this is a joint challenge in both statistical and quantum mechanics. We need to deal with length scales that are on the order of tens of nanometers, and time scales that are much, much longer than nanoseconds. And we got the problem, right? That's the statistical mechanics. The quantum is that we need a sophisticated quantum mechanical treatment, something like dispersion inclusive hybrid DFT, to even qualitatively, right, treat hydroxide correctly. So how are we going to deal with both of those problems? And again, the way we're going to deal with it is using the method developed by Linfeng and Roberto and Wine and E, this DPMD method, right? So we're going to do a deep neural network potential, again, which offers us, something like a 1,000,000-fold speed up with ab initio accuracy. Now, the crux of that is, again, some of the points that Linfeng just made, is that we need black box, robust, accurate, and efficient high throughput data generation. And I want to do that at the higher rungs of DFT. So in order to deal with that challenge, I'm going to introduce C. This is a black box, a hybrid DFT engine for doing, high throughput calculations. So these are just SCF calculations for energies and forces. These are not ab initio molecular dynamics, although you can use them, of course, to do ab initio molecular dynamics. Now, C combines 3 things. The first thing that it combines is the so-called SCDM method. This is the selective columns of the density matrix. This was developed by Anil Damle, Lin, who was also a PhD student in Roberto's group, and Ying at Stanford. So SCDM replaces the MLWFs, right? It's a non-iterative orbital localization method that doesn't, so again, with MLWFs, they're great, don't get me wrong, but they require some system level or system specific optimization parameters, right? Not every method, not every system converges. You have to deal with the initial guess, right? The algorithm that you use to do the optimization. So we're replacing that to make it a black box engine, even though the SCDM orbitals will not be exactly as tight as the MLWFs in every sense of the word, right? And we combine that with the EXX beta method, which we just described, a linear scaling algorithm, exact exchange algorithm for finite gap systems. Again, finite gap because we have to be able to localize. Of course, with new localization methods from anneal and NLin on metals, which we can potentially consider those in the near future. But those combination of having local orbitals in EXX gives us 2 levels of savings. The pairs in the pairs and in the domains where we solve Poisson's equation. So that gives us 2 levels of savings. The third level of savings we're going to get is by combining this with the ACE calculation, right? So ACE is this adaptively compressed exchange. This is, again, another development by Lin, where it's a low rank decomposition of the exchange operator, and that reduces the number of full rank exact exchange calls that we need to do during SCF. So this is the first approach to harness all 3 levels of savings. Again, there's been other thrusts in this direction, notably by Paolo Giannozzi, where he used 2 of the levels of savings, the pair selection and the ACE operator, as well as Nisant and Nair, who did a very similar approach. This one does all 3, so we're hoping to squeeze out an additional level of savings. And the targeted applications, of course, are material screening, like polymorph screening, sampling potential energy surfaces, and data generation for machine learning applications. And again, it has no system-dependent parameters. All you need to set is epsilon, which is how much of the orbitals do you want to encompass, which is directly mapped to the accuracy of the approach. The algorithmic implementation is a little bit in the weeds, so I'll leave this at the moment. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to go through this, especially because I'm a little bit over time. Again, we just do it in a slightly different way because of our method, right? We have some in real space and, of course, some in reciprocal space. All right, so here, let me show you some results. Here's let's look at the left-hand side. Right, so what we're plotting now is the speed up in the ACE construction step. This is the bottleneck in the ACE calculations in PWSCF. And on the left, the y-axis, this is the accuracy, but it's in percent, folks, right? So this is a very, very small percentage. Right, so we took 200 Water 64 configurations. This was from an active machine learning that was done in the Roberto's group. So this includes Water 64 configurations that have densities as low as 0.5 and as high as 1.5. It also includes configurations where they're auto-ionized. So a nice, good test set. All right, so what do you see? The first thing is the accuracy. We have a median accuracy of about 5.2 times 10 to the minus 3%. So we're very, very accurate with the default settings. And what's really cool about this is even for high density systems and low density systems, we basically get flat accuracy, which is remarkable. And it's from a couple of tricks that we do inside the code to make sure that that's true, because this is really important when you're either doing dynamics or sampling a service. The error in the forces, I should say, is something like 10 to the minus 4 Hartrees per Bohr, which is lower than typical convergence criteria during geometry optimizations in quantum espresso. Now, of course, interestingly and great is that the median speed up is about 20, right? So we get a factor of 20 using this method versus the ACE, the PW implementation of exact exchange using the ACE operator. And again, for the high density systems, that you get about an order of magnitude, a factor of 10. For the lower density systems, you can get maybe a factor of 30 or higher. So this is a great result, right? And then, you know, just for a proof of principle, we trained a DNN model at the PB0 level, and just to see that we can do it, right? And we were able to do that with very, very little expense. You know, almost 9,000 configurations were included, active learning. We trained it at 300 Kelvin and 1 bar, right? You see our model deviation here is quite good, right? We trained it at ambient conditions, and then we even tested it for, and this was Water 64, we tested it for Water 512 at an elevated temperature, and you see our error, Rubin square error, is still below the sort of standard convergence criteria for geometry optimizations. So again, these calculations show, right? We're doing it on Water 512, by the way, which is of course not even possible with the PW implementation right now, and we can do that fairly straightforwardly, right? And again, at the hybrid level. And then we've done additional development where we've GPU enabled the code. This gives us an additional speed of 9 in the computation, not of course in the communication and other parts of the code. It's scalable to multiple GPUs. So looking for tomorrow, right, we're going to be able to hit much bigger systems. And, you know, when we combine this with the C method, right, we are now, we think we can do machine learning models with much greater than 100,000 data points at the hybrid level. All right, so going back to just a couple more slides, going back to the problem at hand, this confined environments. So the first thing we did was we used C to now train using the DPMD method, a DNN model, right, with 20,000 configurations containing water, hydronium, hydroxide in different concentrations, both in bulk and confined environments. Now, let me just show you the first result that we were happy with. Was that we can actually, here are the model deviations, which are not bad, again, are constantly being improved. And the first real nice thing that we found is that we can actually capture the vehicular and structural diffusion in the bulk. So these are CPMD calculations that are from the Nature Chemistry paper with Stefan, Roberto, and Mike Klein. And as you can see, with the machine learning model or the DNN, we're right on top of those. So that was the first result that we were really happy about. How we're modeling the confinement is we're using, at the moment, a restraining potential from Willard Chandler. Basically, it just branches of the Leonard Jones based on how far you are to the wall. And again, we can tune the hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity of this and get even more disturbed and distorted configurations for the model, for the learning. And then, well, we're happy. These are sort of initial calculations I just wanted to show you guys, where we're able now to really put it in an aqueous channel. We looked at the model deviation for channels having a radius of a nanometer, 2 nanometers, 4 nanometers. Again, it's remarkably well-trained neural network. Most of the errors, again, 85% or so of the errors are below something like 0.1 EV per angstrom, again, which is a criteria that one is used for geometry optimization. So we're very happy with these results, and we're looking forward to answering some more fundamental questions with this model in the next couple of months. But we're really geared up to do so. All right, so with that being said, I just want to conclude the talk with our conclusions in future work, right? So I showed that we developed an efficient GPU accelerated framework, computational framework for doing hybrid DFT calculations. We have this EXX beta method, which can deal with heterogeneous systems, and that's the underlying engine now in quantum espresso for doing AIMD with EXX, or the C method, which now takes advantage of 3 levels of sparsity to do high throughput, black box, robust DFT, hybrid DFT. We've already generated 20,000 high quality dispersion inclusive hybrid DFT data for hydroxide, hydronium, and water in confined environments and the bulk at different concentrations, different temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. We're continuing that data generation to answer some of these more fundamental questions about transport in confined environments. And we're looking forward to incorporating long-range electrostatics into our model, potentially with the method that Roberto and his coworkers have been developing, because the next level in our study really should be transport in confined and charged environments where these membranes have embedded cations. And with that being said, I would like to thank my collaborators, in particular Xinyu Ko and Zach Sparrow, as well as folks like Paolo and Stefano, who gave us the configurations for this bipolar system, the folks at NESAP and NERSC and LBNL, we have a NESAP allocation. We're working with people at NVIDIA to do the GPU acceleration, and of course, funding from the DOE and the CAPE Center. And thank you guys for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Robert. It was an excellent talk, and it's wonderful work, a very important development in our field.
Thank you.
We have a question in the Q&A. It's long. I'll read it to you. I hope you can understand it well. So the exact exchange functional with van der Waals forces was significantly improved over the functional without exact exchange, but with van der Waals forces. How does this compare to a functional without van der Waals forces, but with exact exchange? Does the inclusion of the van der Waals forces make it significantly more expensive? Or is the computational expense of the exact exchange so much larger, and one might as well throw van der Waals interactions in as well? Was that clear?
Yeah, perfectly clear, right? So the question is, what are the role of the van der Waals forces? Well, van der Waals, I think, is you should always include van der Waals. Their forces, they're ubiquitous, right? And although they are not a very large contribution to the energy, they tend to be a more sizable contribution to the forces. So I would definitely include them. And from the computational cost point of view, it really matters on how you're including them, right? So if you're in certain methods, they're effectively free. Other methods, they're not as free, right? So, a lot of these, like Grimm's method, Tkachenko-Scheffler, these sort of effective pairwise models or three-body models, I think that those are fairly straightforward to implement and are not that expensive, right? MBD, the many-body dispersion method with Alexander Tkachenko and I developed over the last 10 years or so. I think that's also fairly straightforward to implement, right? I think it needs to be optimized, that method, because it's a bit more involved, but again, for energy and forces, it's doable. So I would, my philosophy here is always include something for van der Waals. One should always have something, right? And I would start at least with the pairwise method, which is effectively free.
Okay, and I have a follow-up question. Is scan included to some extent the van der Waals interactions? Do you think that's reasonable, at least in some systems?
I think that is reasonable to some extent, right? I think there's evidence that scan at least includes a larger degree of intermediate range correlation. And I think for systems that have a correlation length that is, fairly small, right, less than a nanometer or so, like liquid water, I think scan performs fairly well. Of course, scan is still a one-body method, right? Like density functional theory is, unless you go to the fifth rung. And so it cannot, of course, truly and in a physically sound manner capture two-body correlation in the density, right? There you will need a more advanced method, right? And I guess it really depends on the system. So there are systems where that's going to matter more, and there are systems where that's going to matter less.
Okay, wonderful.
And there's, further evidence is that when you try to add in van der Waals corrections to scan, which many people have done, right, it tends to be, you have to be really long ranged, right, which is further evidence for that, at least sort of after the fact.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that Darren York would like to ask a question.
Okay, great.
Am I allowed? I don't want to take away questions from any of the participants for sure, but this was super interesting talk. Hey, I just had a quick question with respect, if you could comment. Do you expect that some of the diffusion properties of hydronium and hydroxide would require things like nuclear quantum effects when you treat the dynamics, or do you think that's not important for these systems?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I think it's something that we're going to consider at one point, right? Because when you're in confined environments, right, I think confined environments are very similar to nuclear quantum effects in some sense, right? They put you into, they just basically add energy to the system. And so I think we're going to consider it. We're going to need to consider it at one point, right? Right now, we're just trying to get that underlying potential, sort of high fidelity potential for the quantum mechanics for the electrons, and then deal with problems like that, right? Yeah, so whereas nuclear quantum effects are not important, or not as, they're seeming to be less important or washing out in the structure, equilibrium structure of liquid water. I don't know how clear it is about how they'll influence the dynamics, especially when they're in weird confined environments, right?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, we're running a bit late, so and I think we can end the lecture part here. Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you very much to all three speakers of this morning session. It was a pleasure having you here. So in the now at 11, we're supposed to start with the hands-on sessions. I have a few remarks about that. I will share my screen. So for participants that will have a virtual machine, I would like to clarify that we will have two Zoom meetings. So this is one Zoom meeting, a webinar for the lectures, and we will have a different Zoom meeting for the hands-on sessions. If you received a virtual machine, then you also will have received the email with the link for that Zoom meeting. The idea there is we will have around 100 people, and we will do breakout rooms with 25 people per room. Simultaneously, we will use Slack for questions. I saw that many people already accepted the invitation. For participants that did not receive a virtual machine, we will not be able to give you the experience that we would have liked, but you will be able to do the tutorials yourselves. You have received the link to the workshop material, and if you have questions, you can put them here in the discussions tab on GitHub. We will do our best to answer them, although we will be very busy today, so there's no guarantee that we will be able to answer. So for the participants with a virtual machine, we're looking forward to seeing you, say, in around 10 or 15 minutes in the other Zoom meeting. So let's see everyone there at 11:10 Eastern Daylight Time. Convert to your own time zone if needed. That's in 15 minutes or 13 minutes now. Okay, are there any other remarks by the other organizers? No, okay. If that's it, we can end this webinar now. Thank you very much for attending, and we're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow, also at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Thanks again. Bye-bye to everyone.